everyone, and welcome to Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast. I'm your host, Ben Watkins, and I'm joined by my co-hosts,
Ben Baver
and John Lopolato. And we have with us a special guest today, Aron Lucas.
Hi.
Thanks for coming on.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Before we get into it, I believe we're going to be discussing a objection to the fine-tuning argument. But could you give us a little bit of a background on yourself? What got you into philosophy of religion?
Yeah, why philosophy of religion?
Sure. So I was raised in a family that I guess you could say is a Jewish family. So my dad is Jewish, and my mom is, I guess you could say she was a Christian, but I've learned since then that they're basically all atheists now. And when I was about 4 years old, that's probably when I became an atheist, because I was watching that TV show Rugrats on Nickelodeon. Do you remember that show?
I do.
Yeah.
So there was an episode where they retell the Exodus story.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
they put the yeast in the bread and...
Yeah. And I mean, probably before seeing that video, I'd never even thought about the concept of God. And I watched the episode and I said, oh, this sounds made up. So I asked my parents about it, and they said, well, some people, this is what we believe, other people believe different things. And as soon as I heard that there wasn't some sort of agreement about this, I decided, oh, okay, well, this is made up. And I didn't really think about it again until college, when I had a friend who very abruptly became an evangelical Christian. He was, flirting with ideas about young earth creationism. And so our back and forth is kind of what got me into this. And just since then, it's just been a source of casual interest for me.
Oh, man, you came in on the dark side, the young earth creationist side.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm still taken aback by the 4-year-old atheist. Also, you're making me feel old, because when Rugrats was a show, that was something that little kids watched.
Yeah.
And I'm about to learn things from you, so I feel old and stupid. So,
yeah, I mean, it seems like there you inferred your atheism from religious disagreement, from what it sounds like.
Yeah, I guess so. I think it's maybe a combination of that, and maybe, I mean, as a 4-year-old, I was not making a Humean argument against miracles, but that was sort of what I was doing. And I was like, well, I've never seen this happen before. It doesn't seem to ever happen. The only piece of evidence I have to go on, I mean, since then, I have learned more sophisticated arguments for miracles.
Sure.
But the argument that was being given to me at that time was my mom saying, some people think this happened. So I decided, it's more likely that this just didn't happen.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's obviously one of the standing criticisms, I think, of any particular religious tradition is the problem of religious disagreement. And I think you were even able to appreciate the reason-giving force of that back then, which is, I'm impressed.
Well, I might also be remembering this incorrectly and making it seem like I was a very smart 4-year-old.
Confabulation and hindsight bias and all that good stuff. Yeah.
I think it's a good argument regardless, but...
Yeah, although it might be a slightly better argument for agnosticism, like undermining the justification you thought you had for belief in God.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
I guess you could make some sort of a argument about intrinsic probabilities and say in the absence of positive evidence, theism has a lower intrinsic probability.
Yeah, well, you're not going to make that argument at 4.
Yes, yeah, that's not what I was thinking.
I just want to watch a 4-year-old drop the term intrinsic probability and just watch everyone's room just get real big.
Oh my gosh.
Like, what did that kid just say?
Yeah. So I thought it would be interesting to have you on this episode on our show, because I really liked your paper, Naturalism, Fine-Tuning, and Flies.
Right.
And in that paper, you made a particular point that I thought was super a good point, which was that basically we can't be sure that our laws are any less contingent, right, than our constants, the fundamental constants that fine-tuning proponents talk about. So fine-tuning argument basically says that you could vary, if you were to vary the constants just a little bit, then life wouldn't be able to exist, right? The fundamental constants that govern the way that the physical world works.
Mhm.
But they hold the laws of physics constant. They just vary the values that you plug into these equations, right? And so what they're only considering how likely it would be for life to exist in possible worlds or possible universes that share our laws of nature, right?
Right. So
can I ask one question just to make sure I'm clear on what you were saying there, Ben? They hold the laws of nature constant and all the constants except for one, right? You just change,
they could,
right? Because I think because it's a different claim if you say that you change multiple constants.
the claim that I'm focusing on is I'm willing to grant for the sake of argument. I'm not a physicist, so I'm in no position to dispute the claim that given the laws of physics we have, if you consider all possible universes that have those physics, the subset of universes that are life permitting is extremely small. That's the core claim of the fine-tuning argument.
Okay.
And what they do is they'll give a Bayesian argument where they say, on naturalism, it is extremely unlikely that the universe that just so happens to be actual would be a life permitting one. But on theism, it's not so unlikely. So this increases the probability of theism relative
I
to
got you. Okay. Yeah.
But the thing that they're slipping in here is that in the piece of they're not comparing theism and atheism. They're comparing theism and the law, and the conjunction of the laws of nature. So let me read this quote from Richard Swinburne, who is, I'm sure everybody knows, is a Christian philosopher. Mm-hmm. So he says, given the actual laws of nature, boundary conditions and physical constants, we have to lie within a narrow range of the present values if intelligent life is to evolve. So there's that big asterisk, which is given the actual laws of nature. So if we grant for the sake of argument that this ratio is small, which is possible life permitting universes with our laws to total possible universes with our laws, if that's a small ratio, that's not the same thing as saying that this ratio is small. Possible life permitting universes compared to total possible universes. Mm-hmm. Because if we're going to play the game of what would the universe look like if we change this constant, why not change the equations themselves? So if you take, for example, the equation for the Newtonian equation for the force of gravity, what the fine-tuning argument does is it changes the variable g, but it doesn't consider what would happen if we had an entirely different. So, and the other variables in this equation are, the mass of two different objects and the distance between them. But it's assuming that the universe, any universe, would have to be governed by this equation. And you can imagine a universe that has a totally different equation, or just gravity isn't even a thing in these hypothetical universes, or there's other variables, and there's no reason to think that if I know on your previous episode you had Felipe Leon talking about mitigated modal skepticism, and he might disagree with this, which is what I'm about to say, is that there's no reason to think that there are other possible universes with different possible laws, and he would disagree with that. But I suppose if we're not in a position to think about other possible laws altogether, then the fine-tuning argument doesn't work to begin with.
I think mitigated modal skepticism would cut the fine-tuning argument off just by saying you don't know that you could have different constants. So I think for the sake of argument, we're granting, hey, these constants could be different. And it sounds like the thrust of your point is that, well, we also don't have reason to think that the laws themselves couldn't be different as well. And
as far as I know, there is no proponent of the fine-tuning argument that denies this. So, all the big names in apologetics and philosophy of religion, for example, William Lane Craig he says, maybe in a universe governed by different equations, the gravitational constant could have a greatly different value and life could still exist. And Robin Collins, who is another Christian philosopher who is probably still one of the go-to guy on the fine-tuning argument.
Yeah, he's the leading guy.
I'd say maybe him and Luke Barnes.
Luke Barnes, yeah, for sure.
He says, our physics does not tell us what would happen if we increased the strong nuclear force by a factor of 10 to the 1,000th power. If we naively applied current physics to that situation, we should conclude that no complex life would be possible. However, entirely new and almost inconceivable physics could occur that make life possible if new physics applies. So they're saying that we have no idea what the ratio of light-permitting universes is to possible universes. So I guess I would just begin by saying, okay, why should we care about this if we're only looking at this tiny reference class and not the entire population of total possible universes? And Robin Collins, so I'm referring a lot to, if anybody wants to read this, this is his chapter in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. I'd say that's still probably the best defense of the fine-tuning argument that I've come across. And he basically says his reason for focusing on just this reference class and not all possible universes is just the unfortunate fact that this is the only reference class that we have epistemic access to. So this is just a purely pragmatic reason. It's not an epistemic justification for focusing on this reference class. So my criticism of the argument is it's unfortunate that the reference class that we have epistemic access to is so small, but that doesn't justify us ignoring the rest of it. And I think we have to just suspend judgment on this probability, because I think the relevant probability is total possible universes total light-permitting universes compared to all possible universes.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. But can I stop you for a second, because I think we should clarify something.
Sure.
So when you talk about the total set of possible universes, I wonder what that set is, what kind of possibility we're talking about. So it's probably not just, say, nomological possibility, because that's all of the possibilities that are consistent with the actual laws of nature we have, right?
So it would have to be metaphysical possibility, or
It wouldn't be broadly logical possibility, because just because we can coherently describe it doesn't mean
right. It's actually something that could happen, be the case.
And I don't think that fine-tuning argument advocates deny that these other types of universes are metaphysically possible. They think they're metaphysically possible. They say it's just safe to ignore them for the purposes of this argument and to focus just on the narrow reference class.
So,
go ahead.
So I guess what I was going to say was, I have a hard time discerning between metaphysically possible universes, which when we're talking about universes that have different laws of nature, versus basically logically possible universes. Once you're talking about what the laws of nature permit, it seems hard to make a difference between the two. I don't know what criteria you would use to rule out a logically possible universe and say, well, that's metaphysically impossible.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I was talking about nomological possibility. That's the kind of possibility that is just consistency with the actual laws of nature. That's different from a logical possibility, right? And logical possibility is basically just consistent, something that's consistently describable.
Yeah, coherent description where you can't. There is no apparent contradiction in the description of it.
Right.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
And I think for the purposes of what we're talking about here is all fine-tuning argument advocates seem to be saying that these other possible laws are metaphysically possible. And one of the reasons I have for thinking that this is their opinion is that sometimes people will say in response to the fine-tuning argument, perhaps there's a grand theory, a theory of everything that shows that the only nomologically possible values for the constants are the life-permitting ones. So fine-tuning is due to physical
necessity.
Mm-hmm.
And the traditional response to that is to say, well, isn't it a tremendous coincidence that of all the possible physics we could have had, it just so happens that the one that is physically necessary is the one that... So they seem to be conceding that other laws of physics with different structures and equations are metaphysically possible. So I don't think we need to necessarily decide what is and is not a metaphysically possible universe, because we're playing by their rules for the purposes of the argument.
I was actually going to make that point. I believe I read Luke Barnes say that. I had a back and forth with, I can't remember the specific apologist, and I was referenced to something that Luke had written, and it was exactly that, because it does seem that it is an open possibility that the reason the constants have the reasons they do, the values they do, is because it's physically necessary.
Right. And I think, I don't know how you feel, but I think that Luke Barnes has a good point. I think there would still be something that needs to be explained. I think a different version of the fine-tuning argument is one given by William Lane Craig. It's not a probabilistic argument. It's a deductive argument where he says it's either due to necessity, chance, or design. So if you could show that it was the result
that's an exhaustive list.
Right. So if you could show it was due to physical necessity, that would undercut his argument.
Right.
But showing that it was the result of physical necessity would not necessarily undercut the Bayesian probabilistic version, because since we're dealing with epistemic probability, it is an epistemic possibility, even if it's physically necessary, that the universe is the way it is. There are epistemic possibilities that go in other directions, so we can still put probabilities on these numbers.
Interesting. So let me pick your brain on that for a second. So when I heard that move the first time, my thought was, well, okay, but it seems like you're collapsing the fine-tuning argument into an argument from contingency, is what it sounds like. Now, perhaps I've got that wrong. You think that you were mentioning you could put probabilities on worlds where the constants meet the conditions for life because of physical necessity versus ones that wouldn't?
I guess what he's saying is, imagine every possible. We have a theory of everything that says, hypothetically, we have a theory of everything that says the constants must be life permitting. The only possible values are these values in the life permitting range.
Right.
But we can imagine a hypothetical theory of everything that said the only possible values are values that are outside the possible range, or outside the life permitting range. So if we, apply the principle of indifference across the space of possible theories of everything that could have been actualized, it's still an infinitesimal probability that the theory of everything that just so happened to be true was one in which life was possible. I'm not sure if that's the same thing as an argument of contingency. I suppose that's something I would have to think about. But it is. I suppose it's changing the focus of the original argument. It's perhaps conceding the point and then changing the argument in a different focus.
Yeah, that's what it seems like. Because then it's basically wide open out of all logically possible worlds.
Yeah, and another issue, I don't know.
Why this set of possible worlds rather than another? And that's obviously going to be appealing to a principle of sufficient reason sort of thing there. So I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah, it's not something I thought about a lot. But I did mention earlier that the justification that Robin Collins gave for focusing on this narrow reference class was a pragmatic one, which is this is the only one we can look at. But a common move among defenders of the fine-tuning argument is to appeal to this thought experiment that was developed by a philosopher named John Leslie. Mm-hmm. And I think this is the focus of the paper that I wrote. So I don't know. Do you want to get into that?
Totally. Yeah, I was just looking closer at that.
Yeah, I wanted to verify, John Leslie, not John Leslie Mackey, not J.L. Mackey, but
no, he wrote a book called Universes, and I'm not sure if he's a theist or something else, but it was one of the earlier defenses of the fine-tuning argument, and he specifically addresses this criticism so I'm not saying anything new, really. I'm just responding to the response to my criticism, which is, so just to recap, my criticism was we don't know what the total population of possible universes look like, so we have no idea what portion of them are life permitting. We only know that it's rare within the subset of universes that we can examine, being those universes that share our laws. And John Leslie says this doesn't matter at all, and he gives this analogy. So he says, imagine you're in a room, it's a dark room, the lights are off, and you shine a light on this limited portion of the wall with a flashlight, and then in the middle of that illuminated portion is a fly. And then suddenly a shot rings out and a bullet kills the fly. And intuitively, you would infer that this bullet wasn't just fired at random. Somebody must have been aiming at the fly. And I think that's a good inference. I'm not going to argue with that. And I think if you can't see what the analogy is here, it's that since even though we can't see the whole wall, we also can't see the entire set of possible universes. We can only see an illuminated portion of the wall. And so Robin Collins has called the subset of universes that we can examine the epistemically illuminated region of the space of possible universes. And just as we can, and this, according to Leslie, and this analogy has been endorsed by Robin Collins and Luke Barnes and William Lane Craig. It's a very popular argument to give in response to the kind of thing I'm saying. They say, just as we can infer design in the case of the fly, that when that isolated target is hit, we can also infer design in the case of the isolated target of our universe being hit. And I'm going to admit that we're absolutely justified in inferring intentional agency in the case of the fly, but we need to think about why we're justified in making that inference. And the reason is because, well, I suppose there are two possible routes you could get to the conclusion that someone was aiming at this fly. The first one is to say the illuminated portion of the wall that we were able to see is a representative sample of what the entire wall looks like. So we know that a bullet fired at random at this wall is very unlikely to hit a fly. And the reason we know that the illuminated portion of the wall is a representative sample of the entire wall is because in our background knowledge, we have a lot of experience with flies and a lot of experiences with walls. We know that it's really weird for an entire wall to be covered in flies. Flies don't travel in packs of hundreds of thousands. So even if we can only see a small portion of the wall, we can safely guess that the rest of the wall basically looks the same. So we're able to make this Bayesian inference where a bullet fired at random is very unlikely to have hit this fly, but a bullet fired on purpose, it's much less unlikely that it would be hitting the fly. So quite independently of the reason of the observation of the illuminated portion of the wall, we have independent reasons to think that the rest of the wall looks the same. And when it comes to the fine-tuning argument, we just don't have this background knowledge to say that the unseeable universes in the set of possible universes are similar to the ones that we can see. So in other words, we have no reason to think that the reference class of universes with laws like ours, which is the epistemically illuminated region, is representative at all of the total population of possible universes. So I don't think that this fly analogy is very helpful. I think, like a lot of cases in the way people defend the fine-tuning argument, they rely on these analogies. I mean, when you read the literature on fine-tuning argument, it's just riddled with analogies. And I think that's why the fine-tuning argument, at least to me, and I know to a lot of people, has this incredible intuitive appeal because it's so often defended with appeals to ordinary experience. And I don't think the ordinary experience carries over to this area. And this is just one example where I think the analogy falls apart.
No, that's a very good point.
Make sense so far?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so far so good.
I was going to say I have an initial worry about this analogy, but I don't know how good of an objection this is, so maybe you can let me know. But I'm thinking maybe it's disanalogous in a way because so with the wall, the fly, since it's lit up, that portion is lit up, you would think that the marksman, the guy who's shooting, is going to have his eye kind of attracted to that area, and then he's going to aim at the fly he can see in that illuminated portion. But with God and the possible universes that permit life, it doesn't seem like there's any region that's going to be illuminated and stand out among all the other possible universes that God could actualize, right?
Yeah,
so,
and I think that is relevant to something I wanted to get to a little bit later, because right now I'm taking for granted that in order to make this inference to design, it all hinges on whether or not we have reason to believe that the illuminated portion of the wall is representative or not.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And some people, so Robin Collins, for example, says he thinks that is the key here. He thinks that as long as we have reasons to think that the epistemically illuminated region is representative, the fine-tuning argument works. So let me read a quote from him. Because we are considering only one reference class of possible law structures, it is unclear how much weight to attach to the weight of epistemic probabilities one obtains using this reference class. Hence, one cannot simply map the epistemic probabilities obtained in this way onto the degrees of belief we should have at the end of the day. So I consider this to be a pretty big concession on his part. He's saying it depends entirely on whether or not this is representative. And I don't have the quote with me now, but in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, he says there's really no objective way of knowing whether or not this reference class is representative. But to go back to your point, Ben, there are people, and this was Leslie himself when he first made the argument, he didn't think that representativeness mattered. He said, even if it were the case that the rest of the wall was covered in flies, we should still think that somebody was aiming at this fly. So it just doesn't matter what the rest of the wall looks like. We can just focus in on the reference class and just only pay attention to what's going on in the reference class. And once again, I agree with him in the case of the fly. So let's say, for example, or for the sake of argument, that the illuminated portion of the wall is totally empty with the exception of that one fly, and the rest of the wall is covered in flies. So it's not illuminated anymore. We can see the whole wall. And then a bullet comes out and hits the fly. Now we ask, what's the probability that a bullet would have hit a fly if it was fired randomly? And let's say there's so many flies on the wall that it's 75% chance. But then we'll ask, well, what's the probability that this fly would be hit if... Oh, actually, let me rephrase that. And what's the probability? Let's say the marksman has 75% accuracy. So it's just as likely that a fly would be hit by chance or if somebody was aiming on purpose. But there's still the further question, not just why did a fly get hit, but why did this fly get hit? And if we're asking, given that a fly was hit, why was it this fly? On chance, it's very low because it could have been any fly that was hit.
Right.
But there's something special about an isolated fly that would be attractive to a marksman. And this goes back to your point about it being lit up. If it's in an isolated region, the human eye is naturally attracted to it. It's easier to hit. It's easier to see. It gives you a chance to show off. It gets you a chance to practice shooting things. So on the hypothesis that somebody was aiming, this is the fly we would expect to get hit. Whereas on the chance hypothesis, we have no reason to think that any one fly would be hit over any other one. So that's the reason that Leslie is right, that in the case of the fly, it doesn't matter whether or not the sample is representative. But once again, we have a problem here because this analogy just doesn't carry over into the case of possible universes. Right, so imagine that prior to just to stick with this fly on the wall analogy, imagine that prior to the creation of the universe, God is looking at this massive wall with different portions of the wall representing different types of universes governed by different types of laws. And within the portion of the wall that represents the epistemically illuminated region, right in the middle, there's a little dot that represents our universe. But imagine that the rest of the wall is heavily populated by life-permitting universes with different laws. So all over the wall are dots representing life-permitting universes, and there are a decent amount of dots. It's not particularly unlikely that a space on the wall picked at random would have a dot. So the thing here, though, is that this is just an analogy. It's not like God actually was throwing a dart at the wall. So I think the factors that attracted the marksman to the fly on the wall just don't apply to God here. It's not like God's eye is naturally drawn to isolated targets. He doesn't want to show off or practice his aim. I mean, this is just a metaphor. So given that God wants to pick a life-permitting universe, why would he want this life-permitting universe over any other one? It would seem that whatever he's getting out of this life-permitting universe, he gets out of any life-permitting universe, because his only goal, according to advocates of the fine-tuning argument, is to create embodied moral agents. And as long as the universe is life-permitting, he gets that. So there's nothing about this life-permitting universe that gives him anything he wants over any other ones, which is the crucial difference between this metaphor and the fly analogy, because there was something about that fly that had something to offer that all the other flies didn't have.
Yeah,
So,
and it's not just the fly alone, but there's no analogy really to the illuminated region, the whole illuminated region, because it's not like God's eye is drawn to a whole subset of the universes that have our laws of nature, something like that, right? Because why would he prefer these laws of nature over others, as long as life is going to be permitted in those other universes with other laws?
So if we're going to stick with this approach of using analogies, I think a more appropriate analogy would be something like this. Imagine that I tell you that I'm going to drive into the city for dinner, and I'm going to go to a restaurant, and you don't know whether I just picked a restaurant totally at random or I picked somewhere on purpose. And let's say that there are 100 restaurants in the city, and most of them are clustered around each other on one side of town. And then on the other side of town, there's one restaurant in an isolated region. So this restaurant that's isolated, there's nothing special about it. There are plenty of other restaurants of the same style of food. It's not particularly well priced. It's not well known to be your favorite. It's not less crowded. You don't know anybody who works there. It's not worse or better than any other restaurant, right? So we have no reason to think that this restaurant gives me anything that another restaurant couldn't also give me. Now let's say that you find out I went to this restaurant. What should you think? Is the fact that it was locally isolated evidence that I picked it on purpose as opposed to being at random? I don't think so, because if I end up eating at this restaurant, the fact that I chose the one isolated one, it's not evidence that I didn't pick it at random, because it was no more likely on either hypothesis, because on chance it has just as high of a likelihood as any other restaurant.
Right.
And if I'm picking it on purpose, it's still just as likely as any other restaurant, because it has nothing to offer me compared to any other restaurant. And that's basically what's going on in the case of God and possible life-permitting universes. Our universe doesn't have anything to offer God that another life-permitting universe wouldn't. So he has no reason to actualize this life-permitting universe over any other life-permitting universe. And I just don't think the fly analogy carries over into this context.
Yeah. No,
I can imagine the theist replying like this to your point. So maybe God wouldn't really have any reason to be attracted to this kind of universe with these laws, but it would still be more likely on the hypothesis that there is this designer, that there would be life in the universe than if the universe just came about by chance or something like that.
Then that takes us back to the original point, which is you don't know that. If you're not focusing on this particular universe, your only point is that life in general is more likely on theism than on naturalism, then we're circling back to my initial point, which is that in order to say that, you need to know what the life-permitting subset is within the pool of all possible universes. Right. And I thought that was precisely what we were trying to avoid by focusing on this reference class.
Okay, good response. Yeah.
It almost seems like it would be an infinite amount for either, right? If you're looking at all logically possible universes.
Yeah,
well, it would it'd be a really, really big number, but it would be finite, right? Like
possible universes? I think the pool of possible law structures is infinite. I mean, I don't think there's any limit on hypothetical imaginary laws you could have.
Yep. Sorry, I don't want to sidetrack, but I did want to say, to tie in, I think your point about the fly and whether or not we have, the reason the fly analogy seems to work is that we have a lot of prior background knowledge about what a wall would look like, and generally walls aren't covered with flies, even if a fly is on the wall. And right. So that's why we would think that, if the bullet hit the fly, it was on purpose. And you're, I think, very correct in pointing out that we just don't have the same kind of background knowledge about what possible universes there are, especially compared to universes with our laws versus universes with completely different laws. And I thought it was interesting just because it kind of ties back to the same kind of reasoning we saw when we had Felipe Leon on about mitigated modal skepticism. It's that we only have justification and believing possibilities when they are kind of like the humdrum, things that we have experience with, right? Mm-hmm. When you're talking about something as incredible, like you said, infinite, like the space of possible universes that could exist with different laws of nature. I mean, that's, like we said, an infinite number. I don't know how you could say it would be analogous to the fly on the wall.
Yeah. One of the, to bring up the point of comparing, finite examples to this infinite area where this population is infinite, Robin Collins he's given an argument. So we kind of jumped ahead and talked about John Leslie and and he's of the opinion that representative doesn't matter. But Robin Collins thinks it does matter whether or not the epistemically illuminated region is representative of all possible universes. And he gives this argument why he thinks our default position should be that it is representative. So he basically says that unless we have positive reasons to think that our sample is biased, we should think that it's not. And he gives an example of drug tests in hospitals using nurses and doctors as their test patients. And he says the assumption of these tests is that we have no reason to think that these doctors and nurses are relevantly different in any way. So if the drug works on them, we should think it'll work on everybody else. And so he's putting this this epistemic principle forward, which is a sample should be thought to be representative unless there is a positive reason to think otherwise. But I think he's underselling the reason why we think these drug tests work. It's not simply that there's no positive reason to think the sample is biased. We have positive reasons to think that the sample is representative in the relevant way. Humans all have, the same analogy. We all come from a shared common ancestor. We have the same basic biology. And there's nothing about nurses and doctors that is different about this. So we have positive reasons to think that if a drug has a certain effect on a nurse, it's going to have the same effect on any other human with the same biology. So, and another point here is that the sample of doctors and nurses is a finite sample compared to a finite population. And the sample within the epistemically illuminated region is finite, but the total population is infinite. So it's hard, I don't see how we could ever say that a sample is representative if it's always going to be infinitesimally small compared to the total population.
It's almost no. I was thinking if it was related to the normalization objection, but that does seem a bit distinct.
Well, I think I'm assuming the people listening to this will know what the normalization objection is. One of the ways they get around that is to focus on the finite region within the epistemically illuminated region, because if you're just comparing one finite subset to another finite subset, or then you would be able to get an actual probability out of that. So I do think that being able to focus in on the epistemically illuminated region pulls a lot of weight in the fine-tuning argument. If you're able to do that, the argument is much stronger, and might fail for other reasons, but it's doing a lot of work in the argument, and that's kind of what I'm.
Yeah, you're addressing a very distinct. Yours is a distinct objection versus the normalization objection.
Normalizability, yeah.
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 I'm great with words, the best words.
So I think you've made a good case here against Collins's belief, his analogy supporting the belief that we should just assume that the sample is representative as long as we have no positive reason to think it's unrepresentative. But suppose he were right about that we could just take it to be representative because we have no reason to think otherwise. Then I think that would cause problems for skeptical theists in their responses to the problem of evil, especially people who think like Michael Bergman, who in his paper Skeptical Theism and the Problem of Evil articulates these non-theistic skeptical theses. They say we have no good reason to believe that the possible goods, possible evils, and entailment relations between them that we know of are representative of the ones there actually are, right?
Yeah, he's
just saying
exactly the opposite of the epistemic principle that Robin Collins put forward. Collins is saying that a sample is representative until proven guilty, and then Michael Bergman is saying if we need a positive reason to think that a sample is representative. And if we have no reason to think that our sample of goods and evils and the entailment relations between them is representative of them, we just can't make a judgment on whether or not a perceived gratuitous evil actually is gratuitous. I think Collins would say, let's work with what we have. And Bergman would say, it's unfortunate that we are limited in this way. And I wish we could make an inference, but we just can't, because we need to be able to see the full range of possibilities in order to make that judgment. I don't know. There are probably a lot of theists who would be happy to say that there is a tension here. The skeptical theism is not, it's unpopular among a decent amount of theists for another reason, which is that if we are not in a position to say what God would or wouldn't do because we don't have the epistemic access to the sorts of moral outcomes that different actions would result in, then we can't make any kind of prediction about what he would do. So one of the key premises in the fine-tuning argument is this outcome is likely if God exists. But an advocate of skeptical theism would say you can't make that judgment at all.
Right. So there is a tension, but like most tensions, this seems to cut both ways, right? So if we deny that we could know that in terms of the possibility space, so you can't make an inference that based on the values of the constants that God exists, then don't they have the clapback to say, well, we do the same thing when we infer skeptical theism. You just don't know the total range of possible goods, so you can't render a judgment.
I suppose they could say that, but what they can't do is, on one hand, be a skeptical theist, and then on the other hand say, let's work with the epistemically illuminated region, it's fine, fine-tuning argument works.
Right.
I suppose the only way they could do that
because one of these is about the nature of our evaluative and moral judgments, whereas the other is about the causal reality. So that's one way that they could potentially put forward a relevant difference between the two.
I don't know if that would work, though, because the thing that's doing the work in the case of skeptical theism is still ultimately a concern about whether or not a sample is representative of the whole population.
Right.
And they are putting forward a principle that would extend. It doesn't have anything to do with the morals of the situation. It's just we have a subset of the sample. The total population is massive. We have no epistemic access to it. And therefore, we just can't say that it's representative. So I don't think any kind of... I think that...
But you could point to the consensus among physicists about the physical world and then point to the, widespread disagreement among moral philosophers and ethics, saying that, look, we just understand these physical theories better than we understand the ethical theories, and that's because our understanding of the physical theories are a more accurate representation of the truth. I'm kind of throwing this out there.
You're saying this is what something they might possibly say in response to that?
Yeah.
And
I don't know they will say this.
Right, yeah. Well, I suppose I could say back to that, well, sure, we have a very good, not me personally, I'm not a physicist, but physicists have a good understanding of our physical world. But we're not talking about our physical world. We're talking about every possible physical world.
Yeah, it's a philosophical question, not a physical question.
So
right?
Now it's more about modality.
Yeah.
And okay.
It's about what we have epistemic access to in either case. So does this mean that we're in the sword always cuts both ways. So if we say, unless we can come up with relevant differences between the fine-tuning argument and the problem of evil, we atheists couldn't say that skeptical theism fails, and also consistently say that the fine-tuning argument fails.
I suppose this is one possible relevant difference that a theist could give between the situation involved in skeptical theism and the situation involved in the fine-tuning argument. They could say, when it comes to our moral judgments, we have no positive reason to think that our subset is representative of the whole. But in the case of fine-tuning, we do have a positive reason to think that universes like ours are representative of the whole. So we haven't talked about this yet. Could a theist give an argument that our subset is like other universes? Collins didn't do that. He just says we don't have a positive reason to think it's not. But Luke Barnes has given an argument that universes like ours are in fact representative of all possible universes. In fact, what he says is that, if anything, universes like ours, universes in the epistemically illuminated region, are over-representative when it comes to life-permitting universes. So if a life-permitting universe is rare in the epistemically illuminated region, it's even more rare in the general population of possible universes. So if anything, the fine-tuning argument is being generous to naturalists and overestimating the probability of life on chance or naturalism or atheism or whatever hypothesis we're comparing it to. So what's the reason for him thinking that? He just gives this, once again, it's a thought experiment. So this is, Barnes gives a thought experiment, and his goal is to prove that universes in the universes in the epistemically illuminated region are in fact representative of the total population of universes. So he says, imagine you're in a forest and you're looking for mushrooms. And he says, as an illustration, it's a good idea to look for mushrooms near other mushrooms. If the conditions are just right for mushrooms around a particular tree in the forest, then nearby trees are more likely than some randomly chosen tree to also be right for mushrooms. Similarly, looking at universes that are similar to ours prejudices our search in favor of finding life-permitting universes, and it is all the more surprising then that life-permitting universes are extremely rare even in this biased sample. So what he's saying essentially is that since life is already known to exist in our universe with our physics, these universes in the epistemically illuminated region are biased in favor of life, and therefore universes with different physics, the ones that I've been saying we don't have access to epistemically, are even less likely to be life-permitting. So unlike Collins, who says our sample should be deemed representative because we don't have any reason to think otherwise, Barnes is going a step further and saying we actually have a positive reason to think that this sample is something we can focus on because it is representative, or even over-representative of life-permitting universes. So once again, I think there's just a problem with the analogy not carrying over in relevant ways. I mean, if Barnes were in a forest and he decided to give up looking for mushrooms after discovering that none of the other trees in his immediate area had mushrooms, he'd be justified. And this is because the presence of mushrooms around a tree is determined by a number of factors that Barnes would know would be shared by most of the trees in the forest, like similar access to sunlight, similar quality of soil and environments, the same laws of physics. But if Barnes then went on to infer that given the shortage of mushrooms in this forest, mushrooms therefore must be rare in most forests, that would be a really hasty generalization because the conditions are not the same in all forests. The factors that caused the shortage of mushrooms in this forest could be totally different in other forests, and he has no reason to think that this forest is representative of all forests. And it would be an even hastier generalization if Barnes then inferred the fact that mushrooms are rare in this forest means that mushrooms are rare in all possible universes, even ones governed by different physics. I mean, this is just an extremely hasty generalization, and it seems to be the same sort of hasty generalization that he's making in the case of the fine-tuning argument. Right. So I think an analogy that's more analogous would be something like this. Imagine two aliens they crash land on Earth on a little island, just like a little sandbar, and everywhere they look, there's water in every direction. And one of the aliens says, man, look at all this water. We can't live here. We need to leave this planet because we need more land. I mean, none of us can swim. And the other alien says, well, maybe not so fast. The ship's computer says that this planet is really big. We're only on this one little area. Maybe there is more land somewhere else. We should check it out. And then the other alien, who was supposed to be representing Luke Barnes in this scenario, says, well, why bother? We already know there's land here. Our search is already biased in favor of land because the conditions for land are already right here. So if land is rare here, land is going to be even more rare elsewhere on the planet. And the other alien says, well, what do you mean? And the alien says, well, we already have a limited amount of land here in our biased sample, so the burden's on you to show that it would be any different anywhere else. We have good reason to think that there's no land at all on this planet. And then the other alien could say, but this planet is so big, maybe the conditions are different in other places. And the other alien would respond, I mean, they might be different, but we already know that our search for land is biased. So what's the point? If anything, this is all the land we're going to find. The land in other places is going to be even smaller. So, and of course, these aliens would be wrong. Land is about 30% of the planet. So they're just making a really hasty generalization. And if anything, the alien is making a much less hasty generalization than Barnes is making, because at least in the case of the alien, he knows that the formation of water is intimately tied to the laws of physics, and he at least knows that the laws of physics are the same on this planet and on other planets. So this at least gives him some weak reason for thinking that if water is abundant on Earth, it's abundant on or it's abundant on this part of Earth, it's going to be abundant everywhere on Earth. But Barnes is going even farther than that and saying it's true even in other situations with totally different laws of physics. And I think that's just going way beyond what we're able to infer.
It seems very akin to the first objection you brought up with Robin Collins's view, in that you can't make that inference when we're talking about the set of all possible universes that could exist with different laws of nature.
Yeah, I mean, imagine if the alien went even further and said he makes the incorrect inference that there's hardly any land on this planet. It's all water. And then imagine if the alien that he's with says, well, how about we try another planet? And the other alien says, well, we already know that there's no land on this planet. All the other planets are going to be they're going to be the same. We have reason to think we don't have any reason to think this planet is not representative of all the other planets. So there's just no land in the universe. Let's call it quits. I mean, that's essentially what the fine-tuning argument is doing. It's saying if life-permitting universes are rare in this subset of universes, it's just got to be rare everywhere else.
Yeah, and it just seems to be this sort of... You're already kind of playing this crazy game where you're saying, well, imagine that the constants could be different, right? And so you're already making this kind of a science fiction sort of assumption that's even possible. And so it just seems that you've got a very good point saying, well, that's not the only thing that could be varied, and we don't have any reason to think that our universe is representative.
Yeah, and I guess a theist could come back and say, I agree, I have no reason to think it's representative, but representative doesn't matter. Representativeness does not matter. And they appeal to the John Leslie fly analogy. So I feel like we're ending up going back and forth between saying it doesn't matter whether or not representativeness, whether or not the sample is representative, essentially the John Leslie position and the Robin Collins position. In order to escape one criticism, you have to adopt the other person's position, and you go back and forth.
Yeah, but you've got an answer for either one, so...
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
I think we're coming up on an hour. I think, was there any other points that anyone wanted to bring up?
I think I'm good. Wow. I feel like that one definitely went over my head.
I think it was great.
Yeah, it was a great conversation, but it's one I'm definitely going to have to go back and listen to, because there was a couple of times where I was like, oh, man, it got so abstract.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, I think that's just the nature of the argument. We're talking about imaginary universes.
I've got to parse it all out in my head.
Sounds like Ben's volunteering to edit this week.
There you go.
Well, Aron, I want to thank you very much for coming on. It was a wonderful conversation, and it was great to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on.
No problem.
If you appreciate the tone and content of what Real Atheology has to offer, please consider writing a review for us on iTunes. All music was created by Work of Wolves. We here at Real Atheology would like to thank our Patreons: Kashi Samarina, Paul Pinos, Richard Kane, Lucas Stewart, Brandon McClarity, John Damon, Michael Tofsrud, Ro Wilms, Ed Atkinson, Kid Blakowski, Andrew Snyder, Jason McCluta, St. Nimbus, Bob April, and Alexander Saunders. If you're interested in supporting Real Atheology, you can please come to our page at patreon.com/realatheology.